We aspire not to equality, but to domination. The country of a foreign race must become once again a country of serfs, of agricultural laborers, or industrial workers. It is not a question of eliminating inequalities among men, but of widening them and making them into a law. Hitler? No. Liberal philosopher Renan. The regeneration of the inferior or degenerate races by the superior is part of the providential order of things for humanity. Hitler? No. Once again, French liberal philosopher Renan. Humanity must not, cannot allow the incompetent negligence and laziness of the uncivilized peoples to leave idle indefinitely the wealth which God has confided to them, charging them to make it serve the good of all. Hitler? No. Liberal Christian pastor Reverend Muller. I know that I must believe myself superior to the poor bayas of Mambre. I know that I must take pride in my blood. When a superior man ceases to believe himself superior, he actually ceases to be superior. When a superior race believes itself to be a chosen race, it actually becomes a chosen race. Hitler? No, liberal French anthropologist Lapag. We lay waste, we burn, we plunder, we destroy the houses and the trees. Liberal? No. Saint Arnaud, France's commander-in-chief of the army in the East. Today, fellas, we're going to be talking about Discourse on Colonialism, written by Omni Césaire. And in this text, Omni Césaire would show one clear thing: that Nazism, that fascism, was not a unique occurrence within the history of the West, as liberal history will so often put it so, that it was some anathema, some odd thing that simply just occurred out of nowhere. But in fact, the logical conclusion of Western civilization, the logical conclusion of liberalism, of capitalism, of Western colonialism, that in fact Hitler called throughout the ages, before Hitler was even a thing, Hitler's words called throughout the ages of Western civilization as it induced onto the world Western colonialism, the most undue barbarity, which raped, stole, killed, destroyed, not civilized, but decivilized, deindustrialized great societies all across the world, from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, Latin America. It is, in fact, a great testament to the fact that liberalism inevitably tends towards fascism. And in fact, Omni Césaire would say that there was nothing special about what the Nazis did unto the continent of Europe. That in fact, fascism was just colonialism turned inward. What the Western bourgeois, what the petite bourgeois of Europe had supported, cheered, clapped on, defended, the disgusting actions against the people of the global South, all the deaths, the concentration camps, the prisons, the brutal repressions. Finally, in its logical conclusion, came home in the form of Nazism. Discourse on Colonialism was written during an anti-colonial renaissance, following the post-World War II period, one that saw many formerly colonized Asian and African nations rise up and throw off their colonial shackles. And Discourse on Colonialism really embodies that turn in thinking, that turn in that decades-old thinking of white colonialism. That optimism that so many had in that 50s era when Africa was seemingly having revolution after revolution. Of course, this optimism would be destroyed by eventual neo-colonialism. Great thinkers like Nkrumah of Ghana were warning the peoples of the world that, in fact, this was a false revolution, that they had to be careful about this decolonial process. But at that time, in the 50s, there was a moment of great optimism, one in which people were finally able to turn back and challenge centuries-old discourses about colonial empires, discourses that had become institutionalized, normalized, were very matter of fact, treated as universal facts. These discourses about the savages being unable to rule themselves, govern themselves, these discourses about the white man's superiority. It was a time to finally tackle these old ideas that could trace their ways back to the 1400s with the Spanish conquistadors and Columbus's ship landing in the Americas. It was a time for once to finally turn back that age-old narrative of the savage versus the civilized, to show finally once and for all that, in fact, those that had claimed to be civilized had been the biggest savages of all, that they had brought with them not civilization, but de-civilization, de-industrialization, de-progress, destruction. That, in fact, in claiming themselves to be civilized, they had turned themselves into the savages in their great conquests. And so this is what Omni Césaire, in his book, Discourse on Colonialism, attempted to do. And it's a very short, less than 50 pages, or maybe 100 pages. The copy I got was a PDF, online pirated, but it was 100 pages, 2 pages on each page, so 50 pages, 2 pages on each page, and most of it was just an introduction, written by somebody else. So it's a very short book. It's a very easy read, and yet it's so rich in this just great attack, an expansion of Marxism from an anti-colonial framework that attacks the white European West and all of its mythos. Césaire was a firm Marxist. He was a confirmed Marxist, a dedicated Marxist, a member of a communist party. And he took an eye from highly developed European proletarian focuses to global South focuses. And he showed that colonialism not only affected the colonized, but also itself affected the colonizers. His great thesis was that in doing colonialism, colonizers hurt themselves, that they became the very barbarians that they claimed to fight, and in destroying civilizations all around them, colonizers sowed seeds for their own destruction. Césaire had this beautiful dialectical way of showing how colonialism planted the roots for its own destruction. How Europe itself he would define as just a creation of the colonized world. How the concept of Europe could not exist without the concept of the Third World, and how the concept of the Third World could not exist without the concept of Europe. Think of Mao, and how in contradictions he explained how there are some identities that are built on being opposites of each other. There's no proletarian without bourgeois. There's no bourgeois without proletarian. In the same way, Europe was a creation of the Third World, and the Third World was a creation of Europe. Without these two concepts, neither could exist. Which, of course, is true. If you look at Europe before the rise of the nation state and capitalism, was there really a Europe? There was a horde of noblemen who owned small plots of lands, who would have interfighting amongst each other constantly. There was no united concept of Europe or a white race before slavery and colonialism and capitalism and the nation state. This is all a recent invention. And in fact, the concept of who is considered to be in Europe in the civilized world has changed constantly throughout history. It didn't include the Irish before. It didn't include the Ukrainians before. It didn't include Eastern Europeans who are friendly to NATO nowadays before. It didn't include Italians to some extent. It was mostly only the Anglo-sized, Germanic, Nordic areas of Europe that were considered Europe, that were considered white. And slowly over time, this concept, as it is ultimately built on nothing, ultimately built on a false truth, ultimately built on a lie, has had to incorporate and shift itself. Because when your ideology stands for nothing, it constantly has to change itself. In the same way that Zionism went from a openly colonial adventure, as Theodore Herzl described it in his letter to Cecil Rhodes, to a decolonial process in the 80s, it stands for nothing. In the same way whiteness stands for nothing. It can go from being Anglos to suddenly incorporating all these races that were considered inferior. Because it stands for nothing. It's an opportunist ideology. Césaire attempted to recognize the Marxist analysis within the colonial context birthed new secondary contradictions between the colonized and the colonizer that even in some cases superseded class struggle. That within said countries, the class struggle between the bourgeois and the proletariat itself was superseded by the biggest contradiction between imperialist and colonizer and colonized, imperialist and imperialist subject. Césaire even saw the coming revolutions that were going to come within the world, the next revolutions that were going to come within our current stage of capitalism, our imperialist stage of capitalism, as not only a struggle between capitalism and socialism, but in fact, he ultimately saw it as a struggle to overthrow the whole racist, colonial, Western system and its rotten ideology. First of all, we have to learn a little brief history of Césaire. Césaire was born in Martinique, which is an island within the Caribbean, and he was a very smart fellow, very highly educated. And Martinique is still under French rule, and it was a French colony at that time, of course. I'm sorry, right now I'm searching. Yes, it still is under French rule. I didn't want to talk out of my ass there. And he quickly rose through the educational ranks. He went to France firsthand in order to educate himself, and in fact, became involved somewhat within the French government in order to get French colonies considered departments. He at first was a little bit optimistic that he could reform France, hoping that by doing a departmentalization of France's colonies, he could gain some rights for France's colonial subjects. And of course, that did not work. And he very quickly began to bash even the idea of departmentalization. He became very quickly radicalized. He was involved within communist movements while he was in his stint in the French government, but he very quickly became radicalized to the idea of even reformism, as that reformism blew up in his face. He firsthand experienced French racism, fascism, the lack of truth in the civilized world's liberal propaganda, and its actual practice on its colonial subjects. You know, he was a man who was within even Europe, within World War II. When World War II was happening, he was in Europe. He firsthand saw just a lot of the liberal world and how it did not match up with its actual practice. The ideology that the liberal world gave of this humanitarian, every man is created equal. You know, we are the scientific, rational revolution that created human rights. You know, if you ever watched a Johnny Harris video, that little sniveling liberal bastard always talks about how the Western world created human rights, so African colonialism was okay. You know, he saw firsthand how this was all bullshit, through his own lived experience. Césaire's work was ultimately a powerful blow to European humanism. European humanism, which has justified its colonial slave plunder of the entire globe under the auspices of bringing enlightenment, human rights, science, civilization. Césaire rightfully pointed out that, in fact, no, that Nazism, that fascism, was simply just what the Western world had justified, supported, and done unto the rest of the world, unto the poor Africans, the Arabs of Algiers, the blacks that were enslaved, the coolies of India. Coolies were sort of like slave laborers, but it was more of a broader term, just like coolie meant Indian at that time. It was an odd, it's an antiquated term. But unto the peoples of the global south, fascism was just done onto the people of Europe. What the people of Europe did unto the people of the world through colonialism turned inward on itself. That was the logical conclusion of fascism itself. That was its logical conclusion, that it should turn in on itself. Because when you have nowhere left to expand, when all of your contradictions are finally stretched to their final limit, there's nowhere left to go but inward. When your ideology of divide man up against man, when your ideology of other and in-group, when your ideology of divide and conquer, when your ideology of an anarchy of the markets finally reaches its logical conclusions, finally is no longer able to grow, finally is no longer able to expand, it turns inward, and that is fascism. And so, Nazism's crimes were nothing out of the extraordinary within the Western civilization or the Western world. Think of the 100 million killed in India in just a couple short years. Think of the millions starved in British man-made famines in Ireland and Bengal. You know, there's nothing unique about Nazism. Nazism is just the logical conclusion of Western ideology. And that is what Césaire ultimately set out to prove. That this fascism is your logical conclusion. Liberalism, it is your twin brother that you do not want to admit is your twin brother. To Césaire, the colonial mythos of civilization was a complete lie. Colonialism did not bring civilization, it brought destruction, poverty. Colonialism deindustrialized India, deindustrialized China, left millions in poverty. There were bones when the British took over India, just littering the fields of textile workers who had been put out of work by the British. The British, in fact, deindustrialized these places. They did not industrialize these places. They did not bring civilization to these places. They brought de-civilization to these places under the name of civilization. Barbarity. Barbarity. They claimed to be against barbarity, but they were ultimately the biggest barbarians. And in fact, European civilization destroyed great civilizations. Great civilizations that could teach future generations better ways of life. Césaire ultimately saw that pre-colonial civilizations were somewhat anti-capitalist. Now, I don't know if I totally agree with this. Certainly, future historians, Césaire was writing within the 50s. You have to understand. And within this context, African history was a history in which Africans were not considered to have a history, right? Indian, Asian, Latin Americans, the only people considered to have a history, the only people considered to be civilized, the only people considered to be worthy of any study and any admiration in their past were Europeans. And so in this, Césaire attempted to sort of revitalize the histories of people of color. And so he called their societies that were pre-colonial anti-capitalist. And that's something I don't entirely agree with. And further study has added more nuance to this, showing that, China and India, even though Marx saw these as Asiatic societies that were tending towards an Asiatic mode of production, were in fact tending towards a little bit of capitalism. They had a little bit of industry going on. They were developing towards something capitalistic. But ultimately, what Césaire is saying is that at the end of the day, these societies were more communal, right? People took care of each other in these societies much better than people do nowadays, right? So that's his main point, that these societies were more communal. And colonialism replaced that with a rugged individualism, a man against man, dog-eat-dog ideology, which left millions to die in the colonial world. That was Césaire's main point. And his main point wasn't that we should return to these pre-colonial civilizations. Instead, his main point was we should create a new society that takes the lessons from old societies. And of course, he admitted that these old societies had regressive elements to them. But we should take the lessons from these old societies, these communal lessons, these communal ways of life. Think about Native Americans and how many indigenous people so badly, because this is their land, America, want to preserve the environment and use indigenous knowledge in order to help further preserve America's environments and vital wetlands. In the same way, it's taking these old ideas for a new, better society. And Césaire would even admit that these old societies had regressive elements, but in fact, these regressive elements were not eliminated by colonialism, but in fact kept there, preserved, through colonialism's use of middlemen, feudal lords, who would serve as the middle bureaucrats of colonialism. Colonialism would, in fact, instead of progressing these societies that it took over, keep feudal elements, keep feudal power structures, keep feudal ways of life, these regressive ways of life that otherwise would have developed away in order to help administer their colonial empires, in order to help keep their colonial empires in a state of dependence. So in fact, colonialism did not bring a civilization and progress. It brought regression. It brought destruction, de-civilization, de-industrialization. About the de-civilizing effects of colonialism, Césaire would say, the men they took away knew how to build houses, govern empires, erect cities, cultivate fields, mine for metals, weave cotton, forge steel. Their customs were pleasing, built on unity, kindness, respect for age, no coercion, only mutual assistance, the joy of living, a free acceptance of discipline. That colonialism destroyed people that were able to create and administer great empires, great, beautiful societies, and turned them into hollow shells of themselves. They killed the city builders and they created populations of dependents purposely. Dependent, and then created a narrative of how the colonized need somebody to administer them, when colonialism itself took these great empires that ruled themselves for thousands of years and turned them into dependencies, killed everybody who was able to administer themselves, purposely kept the population from being educated. And so, Césaire looked to these past societies and he said, the problem is not to make a utopian, sterile attempt, to revive these old societies. We're not just simply looking at the past and doing some kind of primitivism. It is a new society that we must create with the help of our brothers, slaves, a society rich with all the productive power of modern times, and warm with all the fraternity and social relations and communalism of the old days. And Césaire would say that the best place doing that was the USSR. That the USSR was an exemplar in how to create a new society based on communalism, old ideas, but with a new society to use to the Industrial Revolution to benefit the majority of humanity and not the few Western bourgeois bastards in Europe, but instead the great, vast swarms of humanity who live under the foot of this system. Césaire would begin this text by describing how Europe and Western civilization itself have attempted and failed to solve two major problems that they themselves have created. European civilization, through its Industrial Revolution, through its invention of capitalism, created the proletariat problem and colonialism problem, both of which it has thus after creating them, tried to ignore, instead going further and further into its own hypocrisy, into a sunk cost fallacy. After creating a contradictory class, the proletariat, who have nothing, after forcibly proletarianizing the whole world in capital's endless seeking of profits. Remember Lenin's imperialism. right? What happened in Europe, right? Capitalism in its earliest stages always starts out as small businesses, right? Eventually, because capitalism is a competitive system, these small businesses fight each other and they win. And the ones that win consolidate more and more, and they become big monopolies. These monopolies combine with big banking to create monopoly finance capital. And after they are done conquering, right, because capitalism is a war. Capitalism is a war. After they are done conquering with that war on the home front, these big behemoths of industry, these big behemoths of finance monopoly capital, all that is left to do is conquer the rest of the world. Once you conquer your home territory, like Great Britain, all that's left to do is conquer the rest of the world. The Indias and faraway Africas and the faraway Middle East, the Iraqs, the Chinas. Once your finance monopoly capital has nowhere left to expand, nowhere left to grow, no more markets to dominate within your own country, when it's conquered Wales and Edinburgh, when it's conquered Dublin, when it's conquered, which of course, you know, these are cities outside of England. I'm not that stupid. I know that that's Wales and Ireland. But when it's conquered, no, Scotland. Oh, fuck the British Isles. Anyways, when it's conquered all of these places, Cheshire, I believe that's a city in the English Isles, and if it isn't, it should be. There's nothing left to conquer within your territory, and then all that's left to do is expand, take over other places. And that is imperialism. And that imperialism happens at an unequal exchange. It leaves the people there with destitution, poverty, nothing. You get the victory. They don't. And your own proletariat, the labor aristocracy, the proletariat of the home country get the victory, but the people that you dominate, the feudal people that you dominate and forced to become into workers, the proletariat, they get nothing. They waste away. They become cogs in the machine for yourself as the bourgeois, and you give a little bit of crumbs to your labor aristocrats. That is the white working Western class, you know, the British working class, but nobody else gets any crumbs. Everybody else starves. And so this is a system of hypocrisy. This is a system that has created a proletariat problem. And it has created a colonialism problem, and yet it refuses to solve these issues. And it gets enveloped further and further into its own hypocrisy. We see that right now in Palestine. We keep on hearing these Western leaders talk about humanity, civilization, a rules-based order. Where are the rules in Palestine? Where is the humanity in Palestine? Where is the rules-based order in Palestine? Where is your democracy in Palestine? There is none. It's just genocide. Liberalism is built on a lie. Liberalism is built on a lie. That is what Césaire is saying. Ultimately, Césaire posited that Western civilization's lie of hypocrisy shows that what it tells itself when Biden goes up there and says he cares about humanity and democracy, and what it practices as he drops bombs into babies, is what makes it so fatally flawed and doomed to fail. To fall at the hands of its colonial subjects eventually, because it makes enemies out of the whole world. Europe's colonialism isolates itself into an island. The Western world in its colonialism isolates itself into an island with the whole world turned against it. And eventually, the whole world will realize. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but all the subjects of neo-colonialism, as the American empire currently stands, and as the European empires once currently stood, will one day realize who their true enemies are. And when that day comes, they will have nowhere left to hide. They will have isolated themselves completely. And you can see them isolating themselves now as they relentlessly bomb Palestine. What does the global South think of looking at America and the West as it wantonly spends billions of dollars to slaughter people in a 5-mile strip? Millions of people packed into a 5-mile strip, bombs to hell, for no other reason than its bloodthirsty drive for more profits in its finance monopoly capital late stage need to invest its its extra capital into its military industrial complex, its need to check its enemies and keep its oil assets. What does the Western world think when it's looking at the West doing this? It thinks it's fucking crazy. It is digging itself into its own hole. And it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, but one day, the global South will wake up and look at the Western world as the true enemy that it is. And it's happening right now. The Western world every day digs their own hole for which the global South will push it into. The colonized world, I shouldn't say global South, the colonized world will push it into its own grave. Césaire ultimately ruled that colonialism, as an extension to a world scale of capitalist antagonism, economics, much in the following in the lines of Lenin's theories of imperialism, was the true analysis, and not the self-aggrandizing philosophies of colonizers that gave themselves these great mythos about how wanting to do colonialism for God, spreading civilization, ending disease. Césaire ultimately cut through that bullshit. He said, no, colonialism was done for money, for the economics, for the materialist reasons, not for the idealist reasons. Remember Mao's contradiction, the world is materialist. We live in a materialist world. We were lived in a dialectical world. We don't live in a metaphysical world where everything just happens in your head and the ideology trumps the real world. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and check out my video on contradiction by Mao Zedong. I promise I will soon do a video on practice by Mao too, which is also a great read. And Césaire immediately within his work dismantled the connections between colonialism and colonization, saying that in fact the two are the exact opposite and that colonization produces no civilization. Césaire would see that every time Europe killed, raped, stole, and destroyed civilizations in the name of civilizing, it set itself up for its own destruction. It dug its own grave further for it to be pushed into by the colonized world. And in fact, that Europe was the biggest savage of all. And in fact, look at Europe now, as it calls every single enemy terrorist in Palestine. What is terrorist other than the word savage used against the great Aztec and Incan and Mayan empires that the Spanish conquistadors conquered? These empires that were just as great, just as legitimate as the governments of Europe, and yet they were labeled savage just to delegitimize them, just to dehumanize them, just to justify that relentless drive for finance monopoly capital. Well, of course, it wasn't finance monopoly capital in that time. It was the baby version of capitalism, but that relentless drive for colonialism and its assets, for capitalism and its assets. You take legitimate governments and people and ways of lives and you delegitimize them through these nasty words: savage, terrorist. Terrorist is the modern day N-word as is used against Hezbollah and Palestine. And yet, the real terrorists, the real savages are those Israelis, those Americans, those Europeans, those Australians, those New Zealanders, and every doggard state, India, every doggard state that supports this genocide in Palestine, and laugh like hyenas justifying this slaughter, from their Destiny liberals to your CNN liberals. Ultimately, every single person that was raped, every single person that was stolen from, every single person that had their home destroyed became a judge of Western civilization. And ultimately, one day, they will be able to bring down the prosecution, the final verdict for Western civilization. The case has been built over hundreds of years in the lives of destroyed millions, in the lives of destroyed Palestinian homes, and the destroyed lives of Africans. And one day, they will bring down the gavel of verdict of justice against the Western world. And that was what Césaire was saying. And in fact, all these actions, this contradictoriness of liberalism sets in a poison into Europe, into Western civilization, that one day awakens, one day shows that the colonial subjects that they were once doing their horrible, awful actions against, one day they themselves have become the colonial subjects. And that is fascism, that poison that sets itself in through its justification and dehumanization of people abroad, suddenly comes home in the actions of fascism. And so suddenly they wake up to see that poison has slowly seeped in, like a frog in that pot of boiling water. Of course, that experiment is fake, by the way. The frogs had their brains cut. But then that frog in that pot of boiling water, the water finally began to simmer and boil. that poison that was set through your dehumanization of Africans, which meant that no human life was sacred, in your dehumanization of Palestinians currently, which meant that no human life was sacred, finally came home in that form of fascism, in the form of that gun suddenly pointed at you when you had previously cheered at that gun pointed at that colonial subject. And that is the great realization that the petit bourgeois, that the labor aristocrat has when fascism finally awakens. And while Western liberals attempts to explain away Nazism as simply just a freak occurrence is admirable, is cute, the fact of the matter is fascism oozes at the veins of every single orifice of Western civilization. In fact, the victims of fascism were once the fascists themselves, cheering at the people of the global South getting hurt. And it's important to acknowledge that Césaire ultimately is not a supporter of fascism. He does not believe that fascism is a just reward. He sees fascism as just as bad as colonialism. You know, we should not take Césaire's words as a justification for fascism. We should not see it as a just reward for your evil empire's actions. No. But instead, we should see it as a ultimate realization of what liberalism truly is. You know, really think about those quotes from those liberals all throughout history. And Césaire specifically picked French liberals because he was a colonial subject of the French. But think about all those quotes from those liberals that we began this podcast with. And you can see Hitler speaking in Europe before he even ever was born. You can see Hitler speaking in the eyes of Europe, in the mouths of Europe, before there even was a Hitler. In doing colonialism, quote, the colonizer, who in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing other men as an animal. He accustoms himself to treating him like an animal and tends objectively to transform himself into the animal. In his calling of another man animal, he in fact objectively transforms himself into an animal. It is this result, this boomerang effect of colonization, end quote. And as we saw Israelis call Palestinians animals, who are the animals now? The colonizer. Wherever colonialism happened, it is destroyed. There were no human rights. It in fact implemented in authoritarianism, slavery, exploitation, destruction. And there was no democracy or liberal virtues or voting. Liberalism's worst fears of Stalinism were realized in the British Empire's colonial subjects. When we talk about how Europe is not authoritarian, we only mean for its own labor aristocrats. Europe was immensely authoritarian. Every single Western civilization and liberal democracy, quote unquote, is immensely authoritarian. Was America a liberal democracy full of freedom for the people of Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya? No, it was authoritarian. And yet it calls itself liberal democracy. What a stupid fucking lie of liberalism. It is authoritarianism manifest in every single orifice. There is no democracy. There is no liberty. It's authoritarianism through and through. Violence through and through. With a paint of Joe Biden and nice words and rhetoric and humanism. But its practice is not. Colonialism purports to advance societies, but it has the opposite effects. It takes great societies that were already more democratic in many ways, or even had practices of democracy from European counterparts, and de-advances them, makes them less democratic. And ultimately, under colonialism, it was not the colonizers that wanted schools or self-sufficiency for the colonized subjects. It was the colonized subjects that demanded they be educated, that demanded they get schools, that demanded they get self-sufficiency. But they were not allowed to have it. They were kept in a purposeful dependency on the colonizers. And so, Césaire ultimately says the most evil people in the world, in fact, is not the SS guard or the Gestapo officer, but the respectable European Western liberal ruler. The respectable European bourgeois man within liberal society who yells to spill oceans of blood and makes it spill like oceans against the colonized subjects on the other end of his profit motives, but does it with a smile on his face and respectable language. Think of NATO, think of the EU, think of American Congress right now as it makes oceans of blood spill in Palestine. Think about CNN and New York Times and all the liberal academia that justifies this. They are more evil than the IDF soldiers themselves, or the Gestapo officers, or the SS guards, because they control this all. They are the source of this all this violence, and they hide it so well with a respectable language, their air of respectability, this liberal illusion of democracy, respectability, human rights. None of that is true. The enemies of anti-colonialism is everyone involved in the system of finance monopoly capitalism. Our enemies in anti-colonialism are not only the politicians, but everything within the superstructure that defends this system of colonialism. Journalists, think about the New York Times. They are just as much of our enemies as the IDF soldiers. Or academics. Think of all the professors who have created great justifications for Israel. Or the journalists. And while these institutions claim to be objective, truthful, unbiased, they're ultimately tainted by liberalism. Ultimately tainted, in fact, by Nazism. Because liberalism and Nazism are no different. They remain watchdogs of imperialism and continue to carry its colonial mentality with a fake air of objectivism that we call liberalism. And under colonialism, the colonized are treated to be unwholly able to rule themselves as infantiles. Do the Palestinian people get treated as being able to rule themselves by the Israelis or the American regime? No, they're not even allowed to have a state. They're too stupid, they say, to have a state. But yet, when they logically, finally rebel against these systems, these unequal systems, these systems of violence, even just hearing about what happens in the West Bank makes my blood boil. I cannot imagine living in Palestine. But even just hearing it, what Palestinians did on October 7th was logical. It was logical. It was not illogical. But what they do, these colonial institutions, is make it illogical. Make you psychologically deranged as a colonized subject for even daring to rebel. Western scholars and historians try to attempt to claim that the West came up with science, that the West came up with civilization, that the West is the only thing worth studying, but in fact it is not. It is not the center of the universe. It is only the center of oppression. And has much changed since Césaire's time? Has much changed since the times of the British officers and the redcoats in India? No. Sure, in our post-civil rights era world, in our new modern-day neoliberal world, there is an air of being able to care. There is an air of caring about oppressed minorities. But the IMF alone, neoliberal global capitalist system, with its debt entrapment, with its enforced privatization, with its inability to allow true independence for the people of the global south. And in fact, if the people of the global south, if countries in the global south even attempt to get out of the Western hegemon and try to court China or Russia, they are suddenly not allowed to. They get cooed for even the slightest pushback to Western hegemony. Nothing has changed since the time of British rule in India. Only thing that has changed is the language. We are currently living in PC colonialism, politically correct colonialism. And I hate that term, politically correct. But what is this? An Indian, I know politically correct is a reactionary term, but what else can I say when I see an Indian half-black woman doing genocide? Yes, we got Hitler again, but now she's diverse. Nothing has changed since the British officers were raping and destroying their ways across India. They now do that through IMF loans, through forced privatization, through wars in which they claim that the enemy is terrorists. And any nation that truly tries to attempt self-rule in our neo-colonial world, in which America dominates the entire globe, is labeled an enemy, illogical, when in fact it's very logical. It's very logical to get out of the Western hegemon, because the Western hegemon purposely underdevelops you, purposely keeps you in a state of poverty, purposely steals your assets for itself like a hungry beast. For fuck's sake, there's slaves within the Congo right now, and it does nothing. It supports that. It, in fact, created those slaves in the first place by overthrowing the Congo's president. What more is there to say? Other than nothing has changed, except the language. Neoliberalism is not a new stage of capitalism. It is just the same old colonial capitalism, imperialist capitalism with a new coat of paint. Ultimately, the West's purported humanism has never been true. And the vast majority of the European petty bourgeois and the West have been, at best, moderate racists. These moderate racists do not believe that there should be outright violence done upon the colonial peoples of the world, but that these people are still not equal. They're still not deserving of self-rule. They're still backwards and need to pay for the crime of being colored. And that is what we're seeing right now with the liberal. The liberal is the moderate racist. Oh, I care about the Palestinian people, but they shouldn't have attacked first, and, terrorists are bad, and yada, yada, yada. What he is essentially saying is the same as a British redcoat telling you that the Indians are simple, stupid-minded creatures, that the white man is superior, and that they do not deserve self-rule. Omni Caesar saw Europe as a ticking time bomb swallowed by its own contradictions. The contradictions of destroying the whole world around it isolates Europe, and which it didn't have to do it. Europe could have sought, in its global trade, mutual growth with everybody around the world, but the system of finance monopoly capitalism requires inequality, requires domination, requires that endless hunt for assets, that infinite growth in a finite world, that infinite hunger for labor power and forced proletarianization. And so now, the Western world has isolated itself into an island in a sea full of enemies. But they just haven't realized that the Western world is its enemy. But it will eventually. And that is what Caesar is saying in the 1950s. How true does it ring today? It's a vision. It's a vision that rings true throughout the ages, because Caesar did a scientific analysis, a scientific Marxist analysis. And if a system does not change, that scientific analysis does not change, the same exact trends continue to happen. That is Marxism. So Caesar gave us warnings about how neo-colonialism was coming, how America was not a liberator, and how American domination, I quote, Césaire says, American domination is the only domination from which one never recovers. I mean, from which one never recovers unscarred, unquote. What a beautiful way to describe what America is. A domination from which one never recovers. Think about how America punishes those people at the ends of its profit-seeking. There's people in Vietnam who still get liver cancer from Agent Orange dropped on them. There's still babies born in Iraq, deformed from depleted uranium dropped on the Iraqi people. There's still slaves in Libya. Once America finds you, once American capitalism finds you and you're on the other end of American capitalism, of its endless seek for profits, of American finance monopoly capitalism, it punishes you and it makes sure you never recover for the crime of being human and being born on land that was valuable and for having a body that can produce value and not giving that value to that 8 men in America who own as much wealth as the half of humanity, the American bourgeoisie. That is your crime. And for it, you pay for decades, for centuries. That is the disgusting act of colonialism. How long will the people of Palestine pay with all the asbestos, the depleted uranium, and the white phosphorus that has been created through this war? For centuries. Well, decades. I don't know about centuries. I'm not a scientist. And what was their crime? Being in the way of the American empire, of its profit motives. Being an easy way to spend your capitalist glut in your military-industrial complex. Being in the way of America checking its enemies and keeping secure its oil assets within the Middle East. That was their crime. And for it, they will pay for decades. And that was the crime of the Vietnamese man currently with liver cancer and the deformed baby in Iraq, born from depleted uranium. In the end, Césaire posits that the only hope for the West in its inevitable self-inflicted wound, in its inevitable self-inflicted suicide, is a revolution, but not a fake reformist revolution, not a revolution of Hillary Clinton and Kamala and the Democrats, but one that will finally put into power not the tyrannical bourgeois that has ruled the West, and in fact the entire world, the European bourgeois that has ruled the entire world through its comprador bourgeois assets, puppet states, and client states all across the world, but the only class that still has a, quote, universal mission, because it suffers in its flesh from all the wrongs of history, from all the universal wrongs, the proletariat, unquote. Omni Césaire would ultimately believe that Marx is right. But we have to finish Marx's work. We have to expand his work into the era of colonialism. New contradictions have come. Yes, the primary contradiction between bourgeois and proletariat is still there, but a new contradiction has come. Secondary contradictions have come. Go back to that Mao episode. New contradictions have come within our current stage of capitalism. That is imperialism. And we have to recognize the racial aspects of capitalism. That, in fact, black people are doubly proletarianized, and I quote, and alienated in the first place as workers, but also as blacks, because after all, we are dealing with the only race which is denied even the notion of humanity. And so Césaire's work was a beautiful attempt to take Marxism from what it is in the West, which Domenico Lacerdo, in his great book, The Western Left, described as a privileged book club. You know, the Bordigas and the left comms, What is Marxism in the West but a privileged book club? Instead, take Marxism into a tool of liberation and its analyses and the tools that Marx gave us to actually liberate the people of the global South, the colonized, to recognize their primary contradictions. While the Bordigists and the left comms say, oh, I don't support PFLP or Hamas, and, we need a third option, a socialist option, a true socialist option that doesn't care about nation states and yada yada, and is revolutionary defeatist. Césaire said, fuck the Western leftists and their privileged book club, because that's all they are. They are a privileged book club. Getting brunch, doing nothing, and take the tools that Marx gave us and use it for the liberation, scientifically, of the colonized, recognize the new contradictions of imperialism and use it to tackle that. To not take Marxism as a dead dogma, a religious philosophy, but as a living, breathing movement that can actually help people, liberate people, and move history. Not one that remains in the theory books of your white reading book club, Western liberal movement. And that is what the communist movements of the West are. These book clubs of liberals who think they are intellectually superior to everybody else. And with that, fellas, I bid adieu. Have a good one. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you.
What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it.
And special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider becoming a Patreon on our membership tier, Patreon. I fucked that up. I don't care. This is it.